Alright, hello again to everyone watching these Kaijudo videos. Today, bringing the recap for Kaijudo Open number 7, which concluded a few weeks ago now. So, obviously, looking at the results here, I finished 4-0, won the tournament, so another win for myself, which was pretty happy with the deck I got to do it with this time. Andros finished second, 3-1. Quad Alpha finished 2-2 this time around, and unfortunately, just a 5-player round-robin tournament, so another small one, but yeah, it was a fun to play. And just going over the final results here, unfortunately, we had basically another one of these perfect ladders where Dark Center ended up going 0-4. Louis won 3. Dark Center played Fire Nature Light Foulbyrn Dragon deck. Unfortunately, actually, he got busy and had to concede the last match against Louis. So Louis had finished with a 1-3 record, but they didn't really get to play their match. Now, technically, I did just play against Louis with Darksinder's deck just for fun to see how it would have played out and just give him that the chance to play the matchup. I did win with Darksinder's deck technically, so I don't know, I drew really well, but I don't know, you can think about that however you want to. We just played for fun though, so Louis ended up finishing 1-3 with his Fire Dark Nature Light Control deck. Quad Alpha played Water Dark Aggro this time, so off the Panopter stuff, but brought Water Dark Aggro, which I know is a deck he's been playing a lot in Duel Masters and doing well with in tournaments over there, so working on a build in Kaijudo as well. Andros went back to Water Fire Light Oath Dragons, so went back to the tried and true. Ended up finishing 3-1, which is actually the first tournament loss for Oath Dragons so far. I think between Andros and I, we were like 9-0 with that deck. We just won 3 tournaments. Now it's 12-1 with Oath Dragons in particular. So the first tournament loss, and then I played the Water Dark Fire Nature Control deck that I profiled on the channel in the last big deck profile with like I think maybe 2 or 3 card changes. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, I ended up playing Water Dark Fire Nature Control, which honestly a lot of it was just my guess on the meta. I felt like it was like the right call to play that because going into things, I mean, I can talk about it a little more, but going into things, I kind of knew Darksigner was going to play his dragon deck, and I made a few card choices to counter it. And I also I had a feeling that like Louis' control deck, I had a feeling he was going to bring Fire Dark Nature Light Control, but I also saw him post a list that didn't play Haven, so I felt that kind of gave me the confidence to actually bring the Water Dark Fire Nature Control deck, which can't beat a Haven to save its life, but yeah, so I felt like it would be kind of the perfect storm to actually bring this deck and maybe do well with it, and end up getting able to do so. So, all right, so we'll start out with Darksigner's Fire Nature Light kind of Turbo Dragons, I think he calls it. Basically, you have like the classic Foulbyrn. It's basically the main card of the deck that you're trying to build around here. So you have a super heavy dragon count, and you have like Supreme Dragon Bullshack. Now, a couple of things to preface with this list. I know Darksigner plays this deck, and he's played a lot of the dragon decks he's played and built. He's basically taken from his IRL or in real life decks. And I know he doesn't own like Infernus and Andromeda, so he doesn't really build with them. Instead, he went for like the budget route, I guess, in his mind is with like the Supreme Dragon Bullshack, basically, which is a powerful card in its own right. And yeah, so he went that route instead. And initially, I remember he played a lot of Lightwater Fire builds, and decided to instead go like full nature package, which is Sprout, which is maybe maybe the second best bird behind Nyx. But yeah, Sprout, quite good card, and it gives you another 2-drop accelerant. Reap and Sow, just good for this like mid-rangey, being able to deploy stuff, hit land drops, draw to your good stuff. And then playing Oathsworn Call and some other good Shield Blast to just try to be good against aggro. And yeah, just super heavy dragon count, just hyper speeds, heralds, and then you just kind of try to ideally drop some of that stuff and just swarm the board and have go wide and just put the pressure on. And then Bullshack, you have your 1 Sargon as like a card to search up when it's targeted. So yeah, obviously in Darksigner's words as well, I think it's like you take like a tier 1 concept in like dragons, and then you employ like a tier 3 or 4 concept in Hammer Dragon Foulbyrn, and it just brings the deck down a notch. Like it ends up being a pretty bricky deck, all things considered. And yeah, it has its issues. Obviously, you're playing a lot of like expensive stuff, clunky stuff. You can have good draws, but I find the deck to be pretty weak against aggro, especially like aggros that don't just lose to just like a reversal like kind of board. Like the thing is, like your Oathsworn Call is not as strong as in like Oath Dragons, where they're dropping Andromedas and Awakens that straight up win the game. Like in this deck, it's more like you have your like Storm Spark or your like Oathsworn Call with your Herald out or something, and you try to, but the best you can do is like Hyperspeed plus like Foulbyrn or like Supreme Dragon Bullshack, and like if you try to control the board with that, like just clear all their stuff, like a lot of the time they'll just like have like an instant evolution or like some speed attacker, and they just win the game that way, and you just can't like prevent that with like Andromeda or Awakened. Or they go a different route where, or maybe it plays out differently where you have enough, you just build up this huge board and you just try to like reversal them, where you just take that extra turn you've got to live, you just set up a counter push basically, where you just like, but the problem there is like now instead of just like stabilizing the board with these big powerful creatures, instead you are trying to counter push them, and if they have any kind of good defense, like it's going to work against aggro decks that don't have any defense sometimes, but if they have any kind of like good quality shield blasts, it just becomes really hard to win those games, I think, because then all of a sudden their shield blasts are like that little bit of extra reach, and then they beat you. So I find that the aggro matchups are pretty tough with this deck, because like your Oathsworn Call is not quite as strong as it is in regular Oath Dragons. The other shield blasts are pretty good though, but yeah, it's just a bit clunky, of course, but overall I think like the nature package is pretty good with Dragons. It does smooth stuff out a little bit, and yeah, you don't have like Nyx to take over a game with, but Hyperspeed, very threatening. Foulbyrn, if it goes off, is pretty powerful, so just being able to capitalize in certain spots, but it's pretty weak card to Lyra in a lot of times, and I don't know, like it can draw really well and have its like good hands, but you can also break pretty hard if you don't see like the early ramp spells. Then you kind of just do nothing, and if you pick apart your stuff with discard, yeah, it's going to be kind of rough. But so the deck is quite bricky, but can do some powerful stuff, and it's still playing good dragon cards, so ends up being pretty decent overall. But yeah, I think it's decent against certain kind of mid-rangey stuff. I think it's pretty weak to a lot of aggros, and yeah, against like the heavier control decks, it kind of depends. Like an early Laws, like Sprout Laws is very good against some matchups, and I was also trying like some of my own Fire Nature Light builds that have like Drifting Toadstool as just like another card, like another kind of bird type thing, where you just have Sprout and Toadstool into Laws for certain matchups, and then just try to ramp up that way. And I don't know, you could try going more that route, maybe. I don't know, maybe not in this build, but yeah, it's like okay against some pile decks, like if they just give you time to build your board, but if they see the right interactive tools, it's going to be pretty tough. So you're kind of leaning pretty hard again on Laws in a lot of those like slower matchups. But overall the deck is fine, but obviously it didn't end up having too great of a tournament, losing to the other decks. But yeah, that's Darksiders Turbo Dragons. Alright, so the next list we have is Louis' Fire Dark Nature Light control deck. So obviously this list is pretty mixed stuff with just a lot of like just mid-rangey like creature stuff. Like you have your top end with Andromeda and Awakened. You have a bunch of just like, you have your discard with like Spire Puppets, Mesmerize. You have just a bunch of different removal spells, some sweepers, other top end, and like Keeper of Dawn for those spells, some blockers, like Major Owl is like this kind of anti-aggro tool as well. So I don't know, playing this deck, I just felt like it was a little too, like it was a little torn between mid-range and control. Like you don't have the real powerful top end to go to. Like you're just trying to interact a bunch and hope like an Awaken and Andromeda is good enough to win, which happens sometimes, maybe not all the times. It felt like it wasn't as smooth. It wasn't quite smooth enough. Like there's not enough, like you're leaning really, really hard on Reap and Sow to like smooth out your draws, and you only have 3 of those in a 50 card deck. I felt like Keeper of Dawn is good, but there's like a reason it doesn't see a ton of play in Kaijudo either. Like it just doesn't do a lot of what matters, and it's like almost a little more of like a mid-rangey card. And I don't know, I guess that's one of the problems. Even Major Owl, like honestly, I just don't love Major Owl. Like part of it is, again, like I think I've talked about this in the past, is like maybe I just don't have enough experience playing with the card myself, because personally, like I only ever owned like 1 copy, and I didn't even pick up that 1 copy in my life until like the last championship, and there was like one at the vendor's booth, and I like traded in some like card for it or something. So that was like the only card I owned. I only ever picked it up at like the end of the game's lifespan, and I didn't really start, like obviously nowadays I just like proxy stuff, but I just have historically not played with it a ton. And So that's part of probably what's biasing my opinion a little bit. Like I don't have the proper experience, but at the same time, I've also played with a bunch recently, and honestly, I just feel like it doesn't hold up. Like I don't know, like it's just like it's supposed to be this anti-aggro tool, but there's so many Evo focused aggro decks nowadays that it just doesn't do that well against. It's just yeah, it's just not that good. Even against the decks that are supposed to be good, like these Scamp Laws decks, like a lot of people when they know you have Ow, you don't need to attack into it, and then that's one of the problems is if your deck can't punish them by like playing a different kind of game, like having proactive plays to punish them for not putting on pressure, which this deck doesn't do a great job of. Like if they just hold back their Scamp Laws, then you don't have many plays you can make to punish that. Obviously, it's hard to do that when Scamp Laws punish you for playing spells as well. So that's one of the catch-22s. But at the same time, like you need to find a way to do something, and like just running out of Major Owl, now all of a sudden you like lose it to like a Munculon or whatever. Like they just pierce. I don't know. Like it's just like it does make it hard for them to like take advantage of a Finbar if they're those tempo strategies. But at the same time, like even then, like Sword Horns, Lost Patrol, I don't know. I just feel like it's just not as much of a surprise as maybe it was when it initially came out. And I don't think it's like a reason to play Fire. And yeah, I just have never liked the card that much. I feel like it's a little medium, and maybe it does need to be played in more of a mid-range deck. And I think that's one of the problems is like this deck is a little too caught between like mid-range and control, and it seems a little unfocused and maybe a little too clunky. There's not enough like card advantage, not maybe a little too much removal spells, or maybe not enough. Like it seems like maybe with the Owls and all the Shield Blasts it should be good against aggro, but I feel like honestly just a little too clunky. So I'm not really sure what the right approach is, to be honest. Like maybe you just move away from Keeper of Dawns. Maybe it just was a rough tournament for Louis overall. Like I think he felt like the deck didn't perform well. I think Sprite's Gift is another card. Yeah, I don't love it in this deck. Like I play it in my Water Dark Fire Nature Control because I generate a ton of mana with that deck. Like just have a huge mana zone, a bunch of different options, and I don't know, it just plays differently. In this deck, it's just not the case. Like you don't generate as much mana. You're not like just turbo ramping up into like an Awaken, for example. Like this deck is like just more interaction based, and like Sprite's Gift, maybe it's like fine as a one of with your Keeper of Dawn package, I guess. Like it just lets you access all your deck basically. But I just feel like it's just not that good. Like it's not that good of a card, and I think 2 copies is probably a bit excessive, but yeah, I'm not really sure like where to go with it. Like you can just polish it up a bit, but I think overall the problem is it's just a bit too unfocused maybe. Like it's just not powerful enough as a control deck, and then it's like a little too clunky as a mid-range deck, and yeah, I'm not quite sure, but yeah, obviously Louis kind of had a good experience at least learning where to go from here with this kind of list. Like maybe you just as simple as just like adding back in Havens and just committing more of that route is probably where you should be going, but yeah, maybe a bit more ramp as well, like just more ramp and a bit of Havens. Unfortunately, maybe that's just the solution for everything. You could try cutting back on Owl, but then like what's the point of playing Fire? I mean, I guess Awakened is extra top end, and some Fire removal is pretty good. So I don't know, you could figure some stuff out, but yeah, it's a little bit of a mix of just kind of like a good stuff control pile, but ended up just not being the right mix of cards, I guess. All right, so the next list we have is Claude's Water Dark Aggro deck. And I know after he played a few matches, he immediately started putting together some updated versions after that little bit more experience, and he has some lists that he's a little more fond of now. But yeah, this was the build he brought to the tournament. So basically built around Ramus, the Duskwalker here, which pretty decent card, just good Vortex Evolution. Lets you kind of fill your graveyard or bring stuff back from the graveyard, and that's one of the big things with like your Cyber Traders. You can pitch some of your Rusalkas or Cephalias early game, and then you can just bring them back with Ramus. And you also have like Time Lost Phantom is just like a good anti-control 2-drop, and then you can just maybe use it to bring out a Joko or Bone Blades even to deal with a blocker with Coral. That's a nice little curve you can do there. So Time Lost Coral is kind of cool. And then yeah, just basically just want to curve out, like either take advantage of your early neurons or try to set up for like Duskwalker to put on a bunch of pressure, and then Cephalia to refill. So I think there's like a few card choices. Like I don't love the drummers. I know Claude's a bit more of a fan than I am, as just like a good 2-drop against other aggro decks, maybe just having a lot of power. I think Claude since has cut the Bone Blades and cut Gloom Hollows. I think Gloom Hollows just kind of a clunky card. I know he's gone more the Vicious Coffer direction now, just to mill your mill stuff, set up your graveyard a little bit better for Ramis. I think the other card too was the multi-civ. Like the multi-civ 3-drop lets you both like unleash and bring something back, so I was surprised to not see it in this list. Interesting that this deck, it was fine, right? Like, again, I'm not really, it's kind of similar to Louis' deck from the last tournament. Like, I'm not a huge fan of like Neuron, and even Ramis I find a little underwhelming. Like, they're kind of weak to some certain stuff, and this deck I feel like is a little bit, maybe has too much of a delta between being on the play and draw. I don't know, like, maybe that's not super accurate, but I just kind of get that vibe. And, but yeah, like, Scamp is good. Like, in my testing, like, Scamp was a huge portion of this deck's like matchup percentage against my deck, my Water Dark Fire Nature Control deck, which is to be expected for my deck. But yeah, I felt like that was one of the main cards doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And then, but I don't know. I mean, he did pretty well. He lost to Oath Dragons and my Water Dark Fire Nature Control. Obviously, I think Darksinder's deck struggled with aggro. Like those Vortex evolutions especially can be a problem. Neuron can be kind of a problem for those dragon decks as well, depending on their list. And what else? Yeah, against Louis' control deck, I'm not sure exactly how it played out, I think, but yeah, he ended up doing pretty decent, just being able to put on the pressure. I mean, Ramis is pretty good if they don't find the answer right away, so yeah, it ended up being decent. I think you could just shift around the curve a little bit, maybe just play some different 2-drops. I like maybe just vanilla 2-drop is pretty decent, but I don't know, maybe Drummer's pretty good too, so I don't know, I should give it a bit more credit than that, but yeah, it's just kind of generic, like Cyberlord, good stuff, water stuff, and then you complement it with Ramis and some decent Dark Shield Blast, basically. So overall, just a fine deck. I know, again, he's made a lot of changes since, but should be interesting to see where he goes from here. But yeah, that was Water Dark Aggro, the first ituration at least. And yeah, decent performance for Claude, a 2-2 record. All right, so the next list we have is Andros and his Water Firelight Oath Dragon build. So just a different mix of cards than usual. This time he's on Twin Cannon Maelstrom, which is a card that I've been kind of playing a lot of. No Sky Crusher in this list, which is interesting, but I don't know. I think the Maelstrom is really just a card that's kind of key for beating these like lower to the ground Evo decks with your Oathsworn calls, like Charging Great Claws and Takshas and all that kind of stuff. Like without Maelstrom, you just have like no, like Tor Helms too. You just don't have much game against those decks. Like without Herald to push your stuff through, like you kind of need to build the deck in a different way, I think. So Maelstrom is really good for that. And yeah, what else? So he's got the 2 Tech Dragons with Krogon and Heretic Prince. They're decent cards. Like I'm never really a fan of these cards, like, but they're at the same time they're just powerful, like big one of dragons. You can't go too wrong with them, and they can do some like pretty niche stuff. Like I know Heretic Prince, I think it looked pretty good in his matchup against Darksigner. Like I would argue maybe just like more of like Andro and Awakened Cassiopeia are like just more powerful, but because I feel like if you're playing like 8 mana cards, like I don't know, the deck is pretty mana hungry, and I'd rather just have like either just like more of the like really powerful top end or just play cheaper stuff. But at the same time, like they do have their places where they shine, so it's not the worst to just have like this kind of like toolboxy kind of situation. So yeah, there's spicy one-offs basically. I'm not like, and Heretic Prince can help the mana base pretty well, so yeah, not the worst. And what else? He's got 2 logo scan, which is nice. I'm a fan of 1 to 2 logo scan. 2 Finbar going down on that card. I don't know. Like I like Finbar in certain matchups. It is kind of clunky sometimes, but maybe pretty necessary for some of the control matchups. So I don't know if you want to go down to 2 laws. Hard to go up to 3 sometimes, but yeah, it's just hard to get the mix of this deck right. Like 2 Storm Sparks. I'm finding myself between like anywhere from like 1 to 3 Storm Sparks, anywhere from like 0 to 2 logo scan, anywhere from like 2 to 3 Finbar, 2 to 3 laws. Coral, I don't know if I'm super high on Coral. You could definitely cut this back to 1, maybe 0 even. I don't know. It's hard to get the mix right, but at the same time, the deck keeps performing pretty well. Just good enough against most aggro decks. Good enough against a lot of the control decks too. So yeah, it's just been kind of tried and true. You can try a lot of different things. A lot of different card choices are viable. So hard deck to build, but this kind of list has been doing pretty well in our tournament so far. So yeah, that is Andros' Light Water Fire Oath Dragon deck. So 3-1 record, pretty good, second place. All right, so the final list is the Water, Dark, Fire, Nature Control deck that I brought and ended up being able to go 4-0, so pretty nice performance there. So I think it's pretty similar to the deck I profiled more in depth. I think the main thing was like cutting Scalding Surge and the second Tritonus, I think, and I added, forget exactly. I definitely added this Napoleon, which was kind of a spiteful card choice, I'm not going to lie. So basically, before the tournament, I was talking to Darksigner, and he mentioned like that he was like 50% to play Toxia Rush and like 50% to play his like Turbo Dragon deck. And when I heard that, I knew it was more realistically like 98% to play his Turbo Dragon deck and like 2% to play Toxia. So I don't know. I just felt like he was going to play that deck, and I wanted to be prepared because that kind of matchup, like my deck is kind of bad at killing, especially like through Storm Sparks and stuff. So I wanted to be able to have a deck like base, and then the other problem. So I'm bad at killing, so I have to like stall the game out to build a big board, and then at the same time, and then like drop a Squillis, right? But the problem is his deck just top decks like Supreme Dragon Bullshacks a lot of the time. Like if he can ramp and put me on the back foot at all, then he's just like topping so many speed attackers, and it's just hard for me to like truly stabilize. And like Supreme Dragon Bullshack is like a really difficult card to answer, even with like a Tritonus out. So I was just worried about like all the reach and fast attacks, and they could be kind of tricky matchup if he like just has any decent draw, especially with the laws. So I wanted like a card, and then I just randomly thought of like Napoleon as just this like one card kill, because like Napoleon plus Awaken just shuts down his whole deck and insta wins. So I basically went for this really hateful like counter decking approach for like a deck that Dark Center I thought was probably going to play, and unfortunately, he put the root traps in his deck, which meant all of a sudden, like, because before his list that I knew that Dark Center had been playing had like 3 Storm Spark, 3 Tendrils, and only 2 and no root traps. So I was like, oh, he's just completely cold. It's just like shuts off like half his deck basically, and the only thing I need to worry about is laws. But yeah, unfortunately, he put in the root traps, which complicated a little bit. But Napoleon was still good enough to pretty easily secure me that match. I mean, it came out. One of the games, just he scooped to it because he had to use his root traps on other stuff. And yeah, so I mean, the card did what it did. And then surprisingly, it ended up being really good against both Louis and obviously Andros as well. I wouldn't like play Napoleon just for light water fire dragons, because I think they have a few ways around it. But at the same time, and like there's a lot of precarious spots where you drop it to try to not die, and they can just have any number of cards that get through it. So it's a little more precarious in those matchups, but it's still it definitely adds to your percentage points against light water fire. I can't deny that. But at the same time, the problem is like the card I cut for this was like the second Tritonus. So like the second Tritonus is also very good against light water fire dragons. So you're not really gaining that much percentage in that matchup, I think, from adding Napoleon. But there are some clutch points where it can come out and just maybe win you some games you wouldn't otherwise have played, I guess. But against Darksigner's deck, before the root traps, it was basically just like a huge percent. Like maybe before that, it was like a 40-60 matchup. And then you add Napoleon, and all of a sudden it's like 70-30 or something ridiculous. So like Napoleon alone is just insane for that matchup. So, but yeah, and then it also happened to be really good against Louis too, because his deck as well just had like Lyra's Skycrusher, Andromeda, Awaken. That was all his big top end, and he only had 3 pits. And so I was able to play like just Napoleon would buy me so much time. And then with Awaken to shut down the rest of his deck, and just like the recursion for his like Terra Pits root trap, or I don't think he played root trap, but yeah, I just was able to play and just pretty easily beat Louis by just like dropping all my Awakens and just having big threats and just being the more consistent control deck, just like triple Logos, Mana Storm, Reap and Sow. It's just a really powerful package. It just, you get up to the late game really, really easily. And again, like one of the things that gave me the big confidence to play this deck was seeing that Louis had cut the Havens from his control. So I just felt like that was another part of the meta prediction was like, number one, I knew Dragons was coming from Darksigner, and I felt like Napoleon would just be a really sweet deck. Honestly, I showed Gareth my deck, and I was like, yo, I think, and then I showed the deck that I thought Darksigner was going to bring, and I was like, yo, should I play Napoleon, or is that mean? And Gareth just looked at me and was like, yeah, that's pretty mean, dude. You shouldn't do that. But I did it anyways, because I'm kind of spiteful, and yeah, so maybe whatever, but yeah, against the control deck, that was another part of it too. Just knowing that I probably wasn't going to play against any Havens felt pretty good. And the other part of why I chose this deck as well was there was another person who was going to play named Luxby, and based on my, like, I played a bunch of practice matches with him a few months beforehand, and based on all that information, I knew he didn't like to play controls either, and I knew the deck that he was like scared of was like Light Nature Haven, because I had beat him a bunch with that deck. So I felt like he would be scared of it. So at first I had a thought that he would play it, but then I remembered he doesn't play control decks, so he's not going to play Light Nature Haven. And then I was thinking, well, the deck that he beat Light Nature Haven was, that I told him was good against Light Nature Haven, was Mono Nature. So I had a feeling he was going to bring that deck, and he actually did bring that deck, but then he dropped from the event. And I felt like this deck was going to be pretty good against Mono Nature too. So I think it's a really volatile matchup. I know I'm going into the deep end, but it's a really volatile matchup against Mono Nature. Like, there are games where they win where you just look like this deck is embarrassing. Like, how could you ever think this matchup is favored, right? They just stomp all over you. But then the thing is, like, you just win a lot of close games. Like, you just win. Like, I don't know, it's weird. Like, you just win these scrappy close games, and you look at the like score sheet and you're like, well, I just won like 8 of 10 games. Right? And you're like, wow, that's weird. But then like, or like 7 of 10 games, like, you just win a lot, but they just don't look that, like, they look pretty close. And then, but like the games you lose are like, you lose pretty bad. So I don't know. Overall, I thought you're like pretty good favorite, and I felt like I had pretty favored matchups across the board. Again, against like, I was also pretty scared of like Claude's deck with Cyber Scamps, because I knew he's going to be bringing some kind of Water Dark aggro as well. Like, I had pretty good read on that, which is why I kept the Kaylee in, which was a card I really wanted to cut, and honestly I wish I still did. This card is just awful. Like, it's like the ultimate hedge card. Like, it's just one extra attacking creature, which I kind of want. It's like an extra water fire mana, which I need, and it like helps kind of against Cyber Scamp. So it's like this super hedge, but the card is just awful. So I don't know, I almost wish I just played the Scalding Surge instead, because I ended up cutting the Scalding Surge for the third Bone Blades, because I was worried maybe the small off chance that Darkseid would bring the Toxtra Rush, and at the same time I also knew that like Claude would be bringing some kind of Rammus deck, so I wanted the Bone Blades for Rammus, Neuron, and yeah, so yeah, that's why I brought this. So I don't know, I ended up like, basically, like, this is a deck, I think it's really weak to like Keeper of Laws stuff, and yeah, pretty weak to Scamp, pretty weak to like any reasonable like self-respecting Haven deck. But I just had like I had a pretty good read on most of the decks this tournament, just feeling what what people would play. So maybe, I don't know, maybe I ruined my good graces with Darkseid. Well, he'll never give me any info again. But for the rest of them, just picking up on little clues, I kind of deduced what most of the other players were playing. The only wild card was Andros, which I had a feeling maybe he would bring the Reviled deck, or maybe he just usually brings something good like Mega Bugs, Rush, Light Water Dark Tempo, like Dragons. He brings any number of good stuff. So I wasn't too sure on that. I was worried he might be bringing some kind of Laws deck, some kind of Scamp deck. So I don't know. Again, that's kind of why I kept the Kaylee, but yeah, overall ended up doing pretty well. Like, I think this deck is just good against dragons, even without the Napalmion, like Light Water Fire with dragons, like I said. Like, with the second Tritonus even, like, I think it's still a pretty favored matchup. Like, you just have cheap removal, big sweeper spells are really good, and then ramp into Awaken. Tritonus is just game over a lot of the time. So deck functions pretty smoothly. The biggest problem is like the mana base kind of being inconsistent, and honestly, like, the solution to that is just cut Waylay. Like, you just cut Waylay, you don't need early fire, you just like splash like the top end and sweepers, and maybe like add another Drill Storm or something, and it just makes it would make the mana base a lot cleaner. The thing is, I just feel like Waylay is such like a key card, but maybe it's too big of a pet card for me. But I just think it's like so important to just have that like super cheap, efficient removal against a lot of different things. So yeah, I don't know, I'm attached to the card, but it would be the solution to fixing the mana base is to just cut it. So I don't know, I could see maybe going that direction one day. But yeah, that is a deck. Honestly, I'm kind of happy that it's probably my pet deck, my favorite deck, but I know it's like not the best, but ended up picking the right metagame for it and being able to take down the tournaments. So I'm kind of happy that I was able to pull that off. And yeah, I guess thanks to everyone for watching another tournament report. Thanks to all the other players as well for playing in the event. And I guess we'll see you next time. Bye.